I'm John Griffin. I'm the publisher of Accessibility.com and your host for these webcasts known as Accessibility Matters. When we chose the words Accessibility Matters, we did it with great purpose. 1 in every 5 persons that have a disability today still lives in an inaccessibility world. The people we bring to these discussions are those leaders that we think proactively work tirelessly to change that fact. Today's guest is Cat Noone. She drives a very imaginative startup that's found huge success with a unique twist to their development. Cat, you started Stark in 2017. There are 300,000 designers and developers who agree with a philosophy that claims to blend beauty, art, with systems application. How did you create that differentiation? Where was this idea born?
I mean, like you said, we started, I guess like the end of 2017. But I wouldn't say that we were actively building Stark then. It very much so was what we like to consider at this point, like version -5 or 50 of what Stark would become. But it was scratching our own itch. We were working on a project that was in the health tech space, and it was catering toward older adults, and the solutions that were out there were very dated. They were dated in thinking and intern technology. They were catered toward like enterprise level. Like I as an individual couldn't use it. The tools themselves weren't human readable, or and in turn accessible. You want to talk access, they were not accessible. They're completely out of sight, out of mind. So for me it was just like, why is it that we were able to land on the moon in the 60s, but this is still not intelligent or automated or any of the above, the above.
Hmm.
And so we said, what's the bare minimum? What can we quickly put together that will actually help us at least solve our job, this problem for our task in the most minimum way, so we can kickstart this. We started poking around and talking to a few folks, and yeah, like we said, we built this very basic version of Stark and what it would become, and started sharing things with folks, and on the internet, and people went nuts over it. They're like, what is it that you're using? And how do I get that in Sketch? And because Sketch was all the rage at the time, and market share. And we were like, oh, this is not just a problem for us. Okay. And then at one point we said, let's just share this really janky version of it, and see how folks use it. And so we did that, and it snowballed, and it continued to snowball. And then at some point in like 2018, when it wouldn't stop picking up steam, we were like, maybe we should jump on this full time. Like maybe there's something here. And so we rabbit holed into this very big problem. And then in spring of 2018, Adobe reached out and said like, hey, we're working on Adobe XD. Do you want to bring this to XD? This would be amazing, yada yada. And we did. And just, and then everything went from there. But for us, it was important to, at that point, if we were going to solve the problem, we were going to do it right. And it was important to make the pricing, the entry level pricing, something that eventually, once we added that, that individuals could use.
But wasn't there a seminal attraction to this because you started out in special education
Yeah.
and you learned something there too that you went forward with and developed? Isn't that true?
Yeah. So there were a couple of things that I think I took away from my time working in special ed. One was that, I mean, I had worked on an iPad app for um, children in particular. Now it could be any children, adults, it doesn't matter, but any individual that capitalized and used any symbol to speech solutions, what you'd consider a PEC system. Um, brought that into a really, digital space, and made it ridiculously simple and affordable, for any nonverbal individuals, um, to give them a platform to communicate. And uh, and and I think, that time in special ed, I think the one thing that I always take away from it was that I realized in that time that it wasn't just products that could be designed, it was systems and it was injustice, and that all of that was very systemic. We do so much, um, to help individuals with some form of a disability play catch up, but the systems in which they're, operating in were never designed for them. And so there's so much dancing around that needs to be done in order for them to live, um, in a way that is even remotely close to, as easy as individuals that, are categorically able-bodied. And that was really insightful. And I think, when you figure out what, a founder or, CEO or, anybody that's making anything, joining a team, whatever, does, there's always something before that. Like, I think you need to, in order to figure out what makes anybody tick, you got to tap into childhood. There's roots somewhere. And so for me, with my childhood, I think I I'd come to be very discontent with anyone that was forgotten, that was left behind, or, left alone at that lunch table. I hated the idea that not everyone could participate. And so that ended up becoming, even if though I didn't realize it at first, this general purpose of mine and North Star in terms of like what I would work on and the things that I would say yes to, and eventually say no to.
The user experience is often the marketing pitch. Does that square with the demographic reality as you see it?
What's interesting is that, we're building we're building tools for designers and, developers and product managers, your entire product development pipeline. Because this isn't, there's a misconception. A lot of the tools that existed before Star catered to engineers, and we've come to realize that that's actually ass backwards.
That's an
This
interesting point.
Yeah, this work starts with design. Our work in general, the problem, being solved starts with design. We know that, through data that is very, very public, that, 67, I think it is, percent of accessibility issues start in design. And we know that the handoff process to engineers, is a critical point in which a safety net can be removed, where more, issues can arise. This work starts with designers, but it's not a single discipline issue. It's an entire product development pipeline issue. And that was one thing that Stark realized. Um, and the thing is, when we originally, built up that like janky version, um, we built it with individuals that self-identify as blind or low vision, and had conversations with individuals that are deaf or hard of hearing, and just so many others. And I think the marketing, who we market to and who we are for, are the same people that are consuming the products. There are designers and engineers and product managers um that have disabilities as well. Why wouldn't we build this? Why wouldn't that messaging that we have baked in be catered in a way that makes clear? You can't say that you've built a great experience if it inherently excludes. You can't say that you paid attention to usability. Accessibility is a byproduct. It's a byproduct of inclusivity, and it's if you do it right, um, it's also beautiful, right? Like the one thing we told is that, those two things are not at odds. They shouldn't be, at least. We want to get across to people like, you can do this and it be beautiful. You can do this and it be quote unquote easy, at least as easy as your everyday job. Nothing changes. You're just making sure that your product is usable, right? And it's usable because it doesn't exclude based on, gender or race or socio-economic background, or, like there's for us, what we're doing is feeding you back your job as a designer, an engineer, a PM, um, and making sure accessibility is at the forefront of that. Making sure individuals with disabilities are at the forefront of that. Once you see people, it's very hard to unsee. It's very hard to ignore that. And most people are not, most people don't have ill intent. At least that's what our data shows. They're just ignorant. And not ignorant in the sense always that they are ill-intended and ignoring, but ignorant in that they have no fucking clue what they're doing. And who can blame them? Look at the standards for this. Nobody wants to talk about that, but nobody can read the WCAG. Nobody can understand that. That's not human readable. Nobody knows what the hell the AA and AAA are. There's a reason why that's being revisited, but nobody wants to talk about that. Nobody wants to bring that up. Or at least it's said, but it's said in whispers. Part of the biggest issue with this work is the blank page dilemma. There's fear, there's uncertainty, there's doubt. And what happens when we're scared of things? We turn away from it. It's easier to turn our face away from it because then it doesn't exist. Out of sight, out of mind. We're not going to change humans, but we can change the way that we work. And so, yeah, that's our general approach. It's obviously much more loaded than that, but I think we can build technology till we're blue in the face, but it's really important that we educate people. And so our job is to market this and push out the tools and the messages and the educational material so you can do your job right from the first, touch point.
You mentioned something in one of your articles about unified language, a single point of language. You want to talk
Yeah.
a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think the one thing that I always try to press there is that, that in particular is referencing, or rather it's regarding the discussion of ethics versus business case. And that's a very, very hot debate. And one that at Stark we take a very, we take a very firm stance on. I think part of the reason why people have joined the Stark community and continue to do so and rally for us, advocate for what we're doing, and contribute to what we're doing, is because we are very opinionated on certain things and on most things that we decide to take an opinion on. But because we're opinionated, it forms the character of the company, and the character forms the soul, and from there you can fall in love. And I think regarding language in general, the one thing that we say is that, as individuals doing this work, there's stakeholders, and there's executives, and there's people that, determine the yes and the no. And then there's the individuals that are impacted by the work that we do on a regular basis, not just Stark, but just people in tech in general. And it's really important that we speak the same language with executives, with decision makers. It's really important. It's okay that we'll always speak a different dialect, but it's really important that it's a dialect of the same language. Otherwise, we get nowhere. And the one thing we say at Stark is that ethics changes team culture, just in general. Public exposure changes executive mind. And profit and customer loss expedites action. And so when we're talking to these organizations, both small startups and Fortune 500, like the Silicon Six, like all of these big companies, people in those organizations, we've come to find that true trickle down, like top down impact can't happen. And goodness, I hate to say this, but it's not happening by purely saying, this is just what we need to do. Like, if I wish that we lived where this is the right thing to do is what governed the entire globe, but it's not. And if you look back in history, it never was. It's just not how humans work. And so the one thing that we found is that the two need to exist at the same time. We need to talk about the ethical side of this, the fact that this is the right thing to do, because you're a jerk if you completely ignore groups of individuals, right? Because they somehow are quote unquote different according to you, right? There's this podcast called Unlocking Us, and it's hosted by Brene Brown, Dr. Brene Brown. And there's a episode that she did with Dr. Yaba Blay. And in there, the focus was on shifting the lens on race, but there were these key points that they made in there that that discussed the consolidation of power through the terms of identity and the privilege of invisibility and the assumption of whiteness as a baseline for everything. And you could say, at least in this regard, that there's the privilege of invisibility that comes with being able-bodied, and the assumption of able-bodied as and neurotypical able-bodied as a baseline for everything, and anything else is just a subtraction of that. It gets measured against it. And most of the executives in those positions are, what they'd consider in that episode as male, pale, Yale. And so you there's just no other general understanding. You have to come with a message of bottom line. How are the changes that you're making helping the company meet the bottom line? Well, we're going to help you increase market reach. We're going to build a really great brand that people fall in love with. Because they trust the brand, they fall in love, they keep coming back. And those are conversations that are understood in the same way that the term accessibility, at least when we first started, it's starting to change a lot now, which is great, but there's still this attachment of the term accessibility being attached to compliance. And compliance is scary, right? Compliance is lawsuit, compliance is money loss. And I think for us, the one thing we started doing was, in these conversations, attaching different words to different things and seeing how it sat with some of these individuals. And so instead of always saying accessibility and compliance, we talk about usability and attach these words. And then usability is, these executives know usability because it's attached to user experience. See, now we're starting to talk the same language, different dialects, same language. Different words have different meanings. They're said a little bit of a different way, but it's depending on where you're from, but it's still the same language. And we found that through that, you start to actually invoke this change. You don't want to give them the answer because there's a bit of an ego trip happening too, right? You don't want to feed them the answer. You want to give them that theory, that framework, and then let them figure out how it applies to their organization. And that's part of it too that we're doing. And through there it becomes, oh, I see. And you sit there in the meeting and you watch when the light bulb goes off and you're like, there it is, and it converts. And it's a process. It's not soundproof, but it seems to be working.
Maybe it's working because one of the things that you claim in your Fast Company article that I read, that losing employee diversity also helps you to lose innovation.
Absolutely.
And that not accounting for the disabled in design can mean lawsuits.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
how do you see that? Losing employee diversity is a loss of innovation. Explain that.
Yeah, sure. Inclusivity in general is a driver for innovation and in turn business success because you're opening up new markets, whether it's internally on the team or as a product. And so um, the one thing that these big organizations are pitching is that they're innovating in their space. Now you tell them that they're going to lose that innovative edge. Nope, don't like that. We're talking to people in organizations. It's not always like the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, it's their direct reports and the people that are in like the micro orgs throughout the big company, especially like you have companies like 100,000 people, you're like there's many, micro teams within that. But there's a shared goal amongst the team. And so, I think when we look at what we're doing, Stark wants to turn this work from a need to do to a love to do. And in order to do that, like I said, there needs to be these common these common terms of work and identity, depending on who's doing who's setting those definitions of identity can be really dangerous. And so we have the opportunity to change the like identity and general language attachments that come with this. And if we can start to create these like synapses, these like workflow synapses, innovation and inclusivity, accessibility and usability, um, disability and innovation, then we at Stark, that is a measurement of success for us. When this space is seen as attractive, and that was part of the big reason about Fastco, the article there. Who's sitting in Fastco? There's the Teslas of the world and the Microsofts and the Apples. Like those are where the posts about them are sitting. You have a company that is working to change this space, in those same columns, in those same categories. And now you start to see that accessibility becomes as attractive of a topic as any other innovative company. And that's what you want. You want it to be taken seriously. That is what it takes. But it's like going to the government to try to invoke change. It'll take years before anything happens. And so like how do we move the needle on our front to help everyone else, like to help push everyone else where they want and need to go. And hopefully that changes.
When Bill
Law.
Gates and Paul Allen conspired to create Microsoft, one of the goals that they had was to change the world forever. And they believed that software could be like the wheel. It could change the industrial complex of the globe many, many centuries to come. And so far, that looks like a pretty good dream.
Yeah.
What you're describing right now has a goal extremely similar to that because 20% of the world's population requires accessibility. And it feels like that accessibility is going to come in a large part on the backs of software deployed in terms of life, occupation,
Yeah.
anything that you can think of, safety measurements. It's not about cures. It's now about productivity. It's
Yeah.
not about pity. It's about paychecks.
That's right.
Uh, I think you got a pretty good shot in terms of where you're going with this because you've had extraordinary success for a very nascent business, but you've accomplished a great deal, and so congratulations to you, Kat,
Thanks.
and thanks a lot.
Thank you.